Atheism-of-the-gaps, an argument from ignorance. It is very common for atheists to fill their worldview with atheism-of-the-gaps. We will discuss what this means here. As we have discussed in other videos, atheism has a burden of proof as well. Referring to atheism by another label such as naturalism does not magically remove the atheist burden of proof. Here, I will explain how atheism-of-the-gaps is an argument from ignorance, and how it is based on the assumption that naturalistic explanations must exist even when evidence or understanding is lacking. I will demonstrate that atheism and naturalism should not be invoked without proper justification in cases where science does not have answers. 1. What is an argument from ignorance? An argument from ignorance, argumentum ad ignorantiam, occurs when someone claims that something must be true simply because it has not yet been proven false, or vice versa. In essence, it is a logical fallacy where the lack of evidence is taken as evidence for a particular conclusion. For example, we don't know how the Big Bang happened, so it must have happened by some natural law, or from some previous state of matter. This assumes a naturalistic conclusion without evidence that a previous state of matter existed. We don't know how life originated, so it must have arisen purely by chance. This assumes a naturalistic conclusion without evidence for how life began. We don't know how life originated, so it must have arisen purely by natural law. This assumes a naturalistic conclusion without evidence for how life began. We are here, so abiogenesis must be true. We are here, so evolution must be true. Complex fossilized creatures show up suddenly in the Cambrian explosion, and we do not know how that happened, so that must have happened by random chance and natural selection. We don't know how the higher biological taxa were formed, so they must have arisen by random chance and natural selection. This assumes a naturalistic conclusion without evidence for how the higher taxa were formed. We don't know how free will arises out of matter, so we don't have free will, or it must have arisen by random chance and natural selection. This assumes a naturalistic conclusion without evidence for how free will arose from matter. Atheism-of-the-gaps is when atheists commit this same fallacy when gaps in our understanding are filled with naturalistic assumptions without evidence. 2. The atheism-of-the-gaps fallacy. Atheism-of-the-gaps occurs when atheists or naturalists assume that gaps in current scientific knowledge will eventually be filled by naturalistic explanations, even when there is no current evidence or understanding to support such a claim. This assumption is often made a priori, based on the belief that naturalism is the only viable worldview and that everything must ultimately have a naturalistic explanation. Instead of admitting that some questions remain unanswered, atheism-of-the-gaps assumes that naturalism or atheism is the default position simply because no theistic explanation is acceptable. Examples of atheism-of-the-gaps reasoning. 1. Origin of the universe. The question of how the universe came into existence is one of the most profound questions in both science and philosophy. Many theists point to the cosmological argument, the idea that the universe must have a cause outside of time, space, and matter, which points to a transcendent cause, God. However, some atheists respond by appealing to atheism-of-the-gaps reasoning. We don't know how the universe came into existence, but one day science will explain it in purely natural terms. This assumes that a naturalistic explanation will eventually be found, despite the fact that no current scientific theory fully explains how the universe could emerge from nothing. It is an argument from ignorance because it fills the gap in our knowledge with an assumed naturalistic cause without evidence to support that conclusion. 2. Origin of life. The origin of life is another example where atheism-of-the-gaps reasoning is often employed. The complexity of life, particularly the information-rich structure of DNA, poses a significant challenge to materialistic explanations. While abiogenesis, the idea that life arose from non-life through purely natural processes, is a leading naturalistic theory, it has not been demonstrated empirically, and significant gaps remain in our understanding. We don't know how life started, but science will eventually explain it without any need for God. This response assumes that a naturalistic explanation must exist, even though current models fail to fully account for the leap from non-living matter to biological life. Again, this is an argument from ignorance, as it assumes that because no theistic explanation is considered valid, a naturalistic one must eventually be found. 3. Consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experiences arise from physical brain processes, remains one of the most difficult challenges in philosophy and neuroscience. Materialist explanations of consciousness struggle to explain why and how brain activity results in the first-person subjective experience of being aware, i.e., what it is like to be you. Yet, atheism-of-the-gaps reasoning often comes into play here as well. We don't understand consciousness and how it arises, but it will one day be explained entirely by neuroscience. This assumes that a materialistic explanation of consciousness is inevitable, despite the fact that no current theory has adequately explained how physical processes can give rise to subjective experience. Atheism-of-the-gaps fills the gap in knowledge with an assumption that consciousness must have a purely naturalistic origin, even though the evidence for such a conclusion is lacking. Filling the gaps with naturalism. In all of these cases, atheism-of-the-gaps assumes that naturalism will eventually explain everything, without positive evidence for how it could do so. Atheism-of-the-gaps rests on the assumption that because science has been successful in explaining some natural phenomena, it will one day explain everything, including the origin of the universe, life, and consciousness, without the need for a transcendent cause. This is an a priori commitment to naturalism, not a conclusion based on evidence. 3. The difference between theism and atheism-of-the-gaps. It is important to distinguish between atheism-of-the-gaps reasoning and legitimate theistic arguments that rely on positive evidence and logical reasoning. Theistic arguments for the existence of God, such as the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the moral argument, are not appeals to ignorance. Instead, they are inferences to the best explanation based on what we know about the universe, life, morality, and consciousness. Theistic inference based on evidence. For example, the cosmological argument is based on the scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning, and the philosophical principle that anything that begins to exist must have a cause. The fine-tuning argument is based on the observation that the physical constants of the universe are finely tuned for life, which is far more likely under a design hypothesis than by chance or necessity. These arguments do not fill gaps in knowledge with God. Rather, they provide positive reasons to believe that a transcendent cause or designer is the best explanation for the available evidence. Naturalism must meet the same standard. Atheism-of-the-gaps, by contrast, often assumes naturalistic explanations without sufficient evidence, simply because it is unwilling to consider the possibility of a transcendent cause. This is an atheist religious bias, not a conclusion reached through careful investigation. Just as theists must provide positive evidence for their claims, atheists and naturalists must do the same. Assuming that naturalism is true because science will eventually explain it, is an argument from ignorance, not a well-reasoned position. 4. Conclusion. Atheism-of-the-gaps and the need for evidence. The fallacy of atheism-of-the-gaps relies on assumptions rather than evidence to fill gaps in our understanding. Atheists should not invoke the promise of future naturalism to explain what has not yet been demonstrated. In both science and philosophy, we must follow the evidence wherever it leads. The inference to God is not an argument from ignorance but a rational inference based on positive evidence from cosmology, fine-tuning, morality, and consciousness. Similarly, naturalism must be supported by evidence, not assumed as the default explanation when gaps in knowledge remain. To conclude, atheism-of-the-gaps is an argument from ignorance because it fills gaps in our understanding with an assumption of naturalism, without the evidence required to justify that conclusion. Both atheists and theists should be careful to avoid arguments from ignorance and should instead base their reasoning on evidence, logic, and rational inference. We do precisely that when we provide positive evidence and reasoning for the existence of God. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and comment below if you agree or would like to add your thoughts. If you would like me to respond to your comment, please make a level 1 comment directly below the video. I will respond to all polite level 1 comments even if it takes me a while, due to other commitments.